the scene. He's got the voice that's mean, asking those questions that you never seen. He's got that fire, burning bright and clean. Andrew Keen making waves, break the routine on the Keen on show. He brings the heat, asking the minds, digging deep till they bleed. No sugar-coated truths, no lies to deceive. Andrew Keen, the master of the interview beat. He's got the knowledge, he's got the flair, challenging ideas with a fearless stare. With every question, he's uncovering what's there. Andrew Keen, a truth seeker, he's aware.
Hello, everybody. Yesterday we had the East Coast journalist, troublemaker, Jamie Kirchick, an old friend of mine on the show. He had a op-ed in the New York Times last week. A chill has fallen over Jews in publishing. The endless debate, of course, about Jews and Zionism in America is explosive and very relevant today. At one point, I asked him about the origins of anti-Semitism. I brought up a rather unusual figure, an Italian footballer, soccer player called Mario Balotelli, always in trouble, a black Italian footballer, didn't quite fit in any sense, always in trouble with everyone. And anytime he got into trouble, he used to take off his shirt and reveal a T-shirt underneath, which said, "Why always me?" Perhaps Jews might wear the same T-shirt. When I asked Jamie the origins, why anti-Semitism, this is what he responded.
Types of anti-Semitism and various reasons for them. I think the sort of left-wing progressive anti-Semitism that is going on in the publishing world that I wrote about has a lot to do with this Manichaean oppressor versus oppressed ideology that we've been hearing about for a long time. And the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is seen through this very simple prism of Israel being portrayed as a colonial occupier. Israelis are seen as the white country in like apartheid South Africa, never mind the fact that most Israelis would not pass for white in any Western country. But Israel fits that role of the white country, the Palestinians of the brown country. And in this very simplistic hierarchy that the left has created, the whites are at the top, and the browns or the blacks, the dark-skinned people are at the bottom. And that's how they see it. It's very simple.
The Jews, then, according to Jamie, are the new whites. And I wonder whether my guest today, Shane Burley, he's also writing about anti-Semitism, would agree. He has a new book out. He's co-authored, Safety Through Solidarity, a radical guide to fighting anti-Semitism. He wrote it with Ben Lorber. And the book begins with an explanation, a history of the origins of anti-Semitism. Shane is joining us from Portland, Oregon. Shane, what do you make of Jamie Kirchick's argument?
There's a kernel that I think he's trying to get at, and I think it's the specifics that we largely disagree on. So it is true that anti-Semitism works a little forms of bigotry or oppression because it is largely a conspiracy theory about what we call punching up. So it's a framing Jews as a part of an elite case that's actually controlling politics and finance. And therefore, when you are expressing that, it may actually take the form of like a kind of ground up rebellion. So it may actually feel populist and may even feel anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist. But as we talk about in the book, it's a false pathway for that, right? That doesn't actually express it because that's not how the world works. The difference, I think, with what your guest was saying, though, is that when we're talking about Israel-Palestine, we're talking about very specific politics. We're talking about very specific histories. And just as simplistic as he suggests the left's interpret it, I would say that his characterization of the left's response to Israel-Palestine is equally sort of immature.
Shane, one of the things that Jamie Kirchick noted in his own unique language was that meritocracy has been good for the Jews, which of course is true. Not all Jews are Sheryl Sandberg or Mark Zuckerberg or George Soros. But should we acknowledge that in a free market capitalist world, Jews have perhaps done better than others? We often hear about, for example, how African Americans have done worse. And we're not uncomfortable with quantifying that. but it's rare that you read the quantification of Jewish success in American capitalism.
So I think the question of whether or not meritocracy has been good for the Jews is sometimes the wrong way of framing that question. Because I think what you're getting at is like you said, it's a free market capitalist system good for Jews because some Jews have risen through the ranks. What we talk about in the book, though, is a concept that we call structural anti-Semitism. And this is the returning feature of kind of populist conspiracy theories that target Jews at times of economic tumult. And the reality is that the Western tradition often uses Jews as sort of an archetype or a figurehead to channel class anger, basically legitimate class anger in a lot of cases, right? During the farm crisis of the 70s or earlier peasant revolts. But the target ends up being illegitimate. And this creates a current of unsafety in Jewish communities. So if we're talking about has capitalism been good for the Jews, has structural inequality been good for Jews as it repeatedly injects kind of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories in this populist guise? And I would say no, I think that creates a sense of instability. What has historically been good for Jews is cosmopolitan societies where there's a larger step forward to equality, where Jews can be in partnership with other communities. So I think, like, if we're talking about large-scale community solutions, we're not talking about just sort of the vagaries of the market and hoping that some Jews rise to the top. I think the other question here is sort of, if Jews have been successful in certain fields, do they face oppression? And I think that's actually a complicated question for political people on the left oftentimes to answer. And I think the answer is that sometimes this has basically oppression against Jewish communities as Jews, sometimes has made them poor, sometimes has left them destitutes. Other times it has risen certain people up in the ranks as sort of an example, while leaving other folks sort of unstable and uncomfortable. And so I think we have to look at this a little bit more complicated, with a little bit more of a nuanced lens to understand how anti-Semitism works, because it simply doesn't work like other forms of oppression. And a lot of times we're just ill-equipped to actually discuss it and therefore find solutions.
You dodged that one skillfully, Shane. What about the role of religion? Jamie makes that central, and let's just see another clip from my conversation with Jamie.
With much else of the world, I think it really originates from Christian anti-Semitism, right? Which is that the Jews rejected Christ and they rejected Christendom. And it wasn't until the 1960s that the Catholic Church, reversed itself on its anti-Semitism. But that's almost 2 millennia, right? And so this is so deeply baked into Western society, anti-Semitism is, that I think so many people, including many people who are atheists or not religious at all, including on the left, they say and do things and they don't even realize that they're babbling anti-Semitism.
So Shane, is Jamie right? Is anti-Semitism so baked, religious anti-Semitism, hostility to the Jews as a religion, of course, very different from Christianity, is it so baked into our culture that even atheists have appropriated the Christian language of anti-Semitism?
Yeah, absolutely. That's 100% right. Anti-Semitism emerges, just like Jamie described, as part of the Jewish rejection of Christ, and also all the things that kind of go along with that. Jews continue to have these traditions that you act out in the real world. So actual living life and daily life was important, not just spiritual life, but physical life. All of these elements of Christianity were rejected by Jewish communities, according to Christians, and therefore a general suspicion of Jews sort of emerged from that. What we have today, in a lot of ways, is a secularized version of Christian anti-Judaism, where those ideas, as we moved away from kind of a purely religious culture and then started using the language of science, the language of politics to express very old ideas. So now you have people that have almost no connection to historic Christianity expressing views that really did come out of Christian Europe. And as the West sort of globalized and exported its ideas and its markets and things like that, you start seeing was essentially Christian anti-Semitism repackaged in local cultures all across the world.
So is this a repeat of history in the Enlightenment sense of the Jews being blamed for science, for progress?
I think this is the Western tradition of that sort of building of a caricature, therefore to direct people's rage at. So it is a uniquely European phenomenon, right? It comes from the conditions of that, but it continues to repeat itself because it's an answer to basically a question about inequality. It's how a lot of those in power structure protective elements. So historically, Jews would be blamed for economic conditions of peasantry or of lower class folks in Europe as a way of diverting anger against the monarchy or against those in power. And that tradition has continued because, like Jamie said, it is baked into the sort of like Western narrative of how people think, and that's why it returns so frequently.
Shane, the Jews have defined themselves, and I don't think this is a controversial observation, as the chosen people. At least that's their narrative in terms of God. These interpretations, whether they're more progressive ones of anti-Semitism like yourself, or perhaps slightly more conservative like Jamie's, they also treat the Jews as special, as if somehow they'd been singled out. But there were many other outsiders in the Europe of the 18th and 19th century, or for medieval Europe. Is your analysis in your new book, Safety Through Solidarity, a radical guide to fighting anti-Semitism? As I said in the first part of the book, you ask where anti-Semitism comes from and how it works. Are the Jews special in your view?
I think that the Jews are no more special than any group of people that has defined themselves with a culture, religion, tradition. I don't think there's anything particularly unique. Even the Jewish concept of chosenness doesn't really ring in Jewish communities the way that it's expressed externally, as though Jews think that they're special in some way or elevated in some way. So I don't actually think there's anything functionally special about Jews. Because if I did, I would assume that anti-Semitism actually emerges from Judaism or Jewish people or Jewish character in some way. I think what we're talking about is issues of oppression and bigotry that are tied to social systems like any other. There are certain characteristics that are responding to Jewish particularity, so people will point to Jewish communities and say, oh, look how clannish those people are. And that's based on kind of a misreading of how, Jewish synagogues work and Jewish communities relate to one another. But there's nothing particularly interesting about the way those theories are constructed about Jews, other than the conditions in which they came together. Where Jews lived in Europe, what kind of monarchies and governments at the time wanted to structure their economies around, and particularly how Christians wanted to define themselves. And if you look at a lot of the historic literature about early Judaism, it says a lot more about Christians than it does about Jews, about how Christians used Jews as a way of structuring their own community, about telling people what right values were, how to observe the new Christian laws, how to think of yourself as a community. And they use that by using Jews as sort of the antithesis to that, by saying, okay, you're not going to be like this. This is what we think Jews do. You will do the opposite. So in a lot of ways, this is about how people structured their own power and their own communities by using Jews as an outsider. Again, not that historically different than other communities. It's really in the way that this happened throughout history that allowed it to continue in such a way.
You are the co-author of this interesting new book, Safety Through Solidarity, a radical guide to fighting anti-Semitism. You live in Portland. You're a self-styled radical. We did a show a few weeks ago on the life and times of Chaim Weizmann, one of the founders of Zionism, the first president of Israel. And we talked with its author about this split in 19th and early 20th century Jewish thought between socialism, internationalism, and Zionism. How important is this split in your view, particularly wearing your, I would say, radical hat, Shane, except that you're wearing, what would you call what you're wearing? A more of a radical, what is it called? What you're wearing?
Oh, I was just wearing a knit hat or a beanie.
A knit hat. You look like a leftist from Portland. So this great split amongst particularly the Jews of Europe in the 19th century, between late 19th century, because of course Zionism didn't really begin until the late 19th century, and it became more and more central. And this is, I think, the core theme in your book, between Zionists and the left, and particularly Jewish internationalists.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that the split in a lot of ways is the split in how to think about anti-Semitism. This actually is two fundamentally different approaches. So on like the Bundist side, to a degree on the Jewish communist side or the Jewish anarchist side, you have them in a lot of ways talking about fighting anti-Semitism in the way that a lot of the left talks about fighting oppression now. You know, either it's a united working class against the capitalist class who they think is sort of leading the charge in anti-Semitism. With the Bundists, it's about let's preserve Jewish identity while also fighting as working people, but doing it specifically in the countries we're from. Like we are from Poland, we are from Ukraine. That's actually our homeland, not somewhere else. And then you have the Zionist vision, which is in a way a fatalist vision of saying, okay, anti-Semitism, we thought we had gotten past this with all these development and increase of Jewish success, except now we have pogroms, and later we're going to have the rise of the European far right. So clearly these things didn't work. Clearly the Jewish left didn't work at solving this problem. So instead, sort of accepting its reality, we're going to do what other European states have done, following kind of a German romantic nationalist model, and we're going to establish a state that has a majority Jewish state, and have sort of a kind of a military protective apparatus for Jews, and that will be sort of the solution to anti-Semitism. And in a lot of ways, you go up through the 20th century, and those debates have continued, right? This book that we just wrote exists in that debate, leaning more into the Bundist and leftist vision of what does it actually look like if we took a non-nationalist approach by saying, actually, we think the foundation of fighting anti-Semitism is in our communities now where we live, with our neighbors and with our partners, and finding that commonality. But also really important, making a case to the Gentile world that this is their issue as well. This is not just going to be a Jewish solution to Jewish problems separate from all other people, but it's going to end up being a partnership problem. So in a way, we do carry on that internationalist tradition.
Is it coincidental, Shane, that the modern left is Jewish, or certainly deeply influenced by Jews? Marx, of course, was from a family of rabbis. Many of the great figures in the revolutionary history of socialism, communism, Rosa Luxemburg, Leon Trotsky, were Jews. Again, without wishing to sound in any way anti-Semitic, has the history of the left and the history of leftist thought in the last couple of hundred years, is that in some ways a reflection of Jewish emancipation? And there've been many books written about how Marxism is itself a secular version of Judaism.
Yeah, I don't want to overstate that, but I think that there is a kernel of truth there. I think that if you look at a lot of, not just the 20th century, even earlier, if you look at leftist movements, ones that aren't explicitly Jewish, look at the names of the folks involved, right? Like there are a lot of Jews in these. I've done a lot of histories of anti-fascist political movements, labor movement. And sometimes a lot of these folks will say, hey, all the white folks in the room here were all Jewish, or these were like entire, early Jewish meetings. And there's, I think, reasons for that. I mean, one is, like we talk about in the book, anti-Semitism and in some ways extreme poverty in the Pale of Settlement and other places gave Jews the conditions to want to change the world. I mean, this is just kind of obvious. And I think when you have communities that face oppression, they look at these systems and say, how can we change them? And not just how can we change them? We need a radical change, right? A fundamentally different change. That's a piece of it. I think the second piece of it is also that when pieces of the left have themselves had anti-Semitism, or when the right has used this sort of income inequality as a way of driving anti-Semitism, Jews wanted to be able to answer back by saying, actually, that's not how this works. Let me tell you how this does work. This, in a lot of ways, I think is the origin of the clarity of Marxism and other traditions like that really tried to answer the question by saying, no, it's not like the mysterious Jew in the midst. It's actually a whole social system. Naomi Klein just wrote about this in her most recent book, Doppelganger. But I think you're also getting at what I think is the third piece here, which is the revolutionary tradition of Judaism. I mean, there is a tradition running through Torah, Talmud, through Jewish spirituality and Jewish mysticism of a liberation force, of moving towards a different kind of world, of trying to rebuild the way this new Jerusalem or this new temple, but a world where the lamb lies down with the lion, where people can kind of come together in community and build something different. I think that is actually at the core of Jewish tradition. And we talk about in the book that when we look at that, we want inspiration. we have to choose which Jewish tradition we end up with. What vision of the future are we wanting to pick up on? Because there's multiple strands that go through this. There are right-wing figures in Israel right now that are quoting from Torah and quoting from Talmud and other passages. But I think when we looked at that, we're trying to drive at what is the core mission of Judaism, which is to positively shape the world and heal it.
We're speaking with Shane Burley, author of a controversial, interesting new book, Safety Through Solidarity, A Radical Guide to Fighting Anti-Semitism, an attack on anti-Semitism from the left. Shane is unambiguously on the left. Shane, we're going to take a short break. Thank our friends at Liberties, a quarterly of culture and politics, actually edited by Leon Wieseltier, again, a very prominent Jewish American intellectual, writer, editor. Going to run a short feature on Liberties, and then we'll be back with Shane. And I want to talk specifically about the I word, Israel, which of course is driving all these debates these days. So don't go away, anyone. We'll be back in a second.
The noise, there is nuance, insight. Liberties is not just a journal of ideas. It's a meteor of intelligent substance. It's the place to be for engaged citizens. Politics, opinion, substance. Liberties is a triumph for freedom of thought. A quarterly of urgency, of cultural exploration, of intellectual delight, of immaculate prose. It's invaluable. Subscribe now or find Liberties at your favorite bookseller.
And you can subscribe to Liberties at libertiesjournal.com. We're speaking with the Portland-based writer, troublemaker, Shane Burley, the co-author of an interesting new book on anti-Semitism, addressing it from the left, Safety Through Solidarity, a radical guide to fighting anti-Semitism. Shane, on your X account, your pinned X, which usually people use to define themselves, you say, the only lasting peace is a free Palestine. In my conversation with Jamie Kirchick yesterday, Jamie suggested that all Jews pretty much are Zionists and that the two go together. Would you agree with that?
No, I wouldn't. I think I suspect what he's arguing is that there's a consistent Jewish connection to Eretz Israel, the land of Israel. And that is certainly true, right? It's all through Torah. We'll always be connected to Jerusalem, things like that. But that is a spiritual connection that is much different than the modern political state of Israel, which is itself an entirely different function and came out of a secular Jewish political tradition. So I think this conflation of the two really misunderstands things. I'll always feel sort of drawn to the land of Israel and the history, the buildings. There's a lot there. And I think a lot of Jews feel that. And that is just a fundamentally different construct than when we're talking about politics of a region, which is a different animal altogether.
So I'm not entirely clear on your answer to that one. Can one be a Jew and be an anti-Zionist? Shane?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that has been a long-standing Jewish tradition. It runs throughout a lot of Jewish communities of different types, some political, some less political, Orthodox, not. But yes, you can absolutely be a Jew and be an anti-Zionist.
And if we had Jamie on the show, I certainly can't claim to speak for him, but my guess is he might suggest you're profoundly naive because without Israel, and in fact, we talked about this in our conversation, without Israel, the Jews would be slaughtered again. You already had the pogrom of October the 6th, and you would have a repeat of history. How would you respond to the idea that if you somehow got rid of the state of Israel, and who knows how that would happen, then you would have a return to the violent anti-Semitism of the 19th and even 20th centuries, the Nazi death camps?
Well, I think I would answer by pointing to October 7th. That is not a tremendously safe place for Jews. The conditions of constant conflict and constant warfare do not create a system of safety for Jewish people necessarily. What I think does, and what has done throughout history, is having strong community bonds around the diaspora, both in the land of Israel and elsewhere, where Jews feel like they can actually have a safe place that's rested on democracy, equal rights, and those sorts of things. Now, I think we get back to your earlier question, is it naive, like early Zionists said about the Jewish left and what you suspect Jamie would say about my opinion now? But I think the reality is that if we look at large areas where Jews have been safe and successful, it's areas where they're able to build communities based around that shared sense of communityship with their neighbors, with the non-Jewish world as well. And what we have in Israel is increasing tensions, an increasingly volatile state that's engaging in war crimes throughout Gaza. I do not feel safer because of that, and I don't think that that's a tenable system to create Jewish safety on.
You wrote an interesting piece recently. Don't let Zionists weaponize Jewish suffering. I hate this word weaponize. I'm not sure if you chose it. But what do you mean by this? Are Zionists taking advantage of the history of Jewish suffering to oppress and kill Palestinians?
So I think going deeper into the piece, what the piece talks about is about the historic use of basically looking at people who are facing a genocide or facing mass death at the hands of one army and actually claiming that those victims are the actual perpetrators there. So what I do is I point to a slew of articles and commentators that talk about Palestinians as engaging in genocide, not just Hamas, but Palestinian people more broadly, as then the excuse to engage in an overwhelming barrage onto Gaza, one that's claimed tens of thousands of lives. Like, we're talking about an overwhelmingly one-sided conflict at this point. So I think when we're looking at that, I think we have to think really strong about how we're characterizing people who are essentially victims in this, and whether or not that's being used to basically manufacture consent for an overwhelming military assault that, when we take a step back, looks both unreasonable and kind of horrifying.
You've used the G word, Shane, genocide. It's a hot word, for better or worse, at the moment. People use it, throw it around. Is it a word that should be used? Is the Israeli state guilty of a genocide against the Palestinians in this invasion of Gaza?
I think so. I think the treatment of civilian areas, the denial of aid, the sort of unremittent attack qualifies as genocide because it's expanding throughout the Palestinian people. This is not like targeted military strikes against very specific kind of militant elements. This is something that's affecting the entire Palestinian people that are now being rushed through the Gaza territory, already small, already concentrated, and that there seems to be no solutions for, and that is only accelerating over time. And so I think it's fair to use that word. I might agree with you that I don't think overusing terms like genocide are particularly useful, and particularly in this case. But I think we have to actually look at what's happening here and look at it in its larger historical context. And I think the word genocide is appropriate in this case.
The word, of course, is also used to describe the Nazi genocide against the Jews, the death of 6 million. Are you suggesting that there is a kind of equivalence between what the Israeli generals are plotting in Gaza and what Albert Speer and Hess and the other architects of the final solution plotted in Nazi Germany? Are they similar genocides?
No, absolutely not. There's nothing similar in plan or scale that looks like that. Instead, what I think is important is to actually look at our collective histories and find commonalities there. So I have, historic roots in the Jewish community that has faced pogroms, that has faced genocide at the hands of the Nazis. And I think that learning lessons from that we can share with other people and actually inform our decisions now is incredibly important. And that's what that piece ends up talking about, is what lessons did we learn that we can bring home with us? And again, it gets back to that sort of piece of the sort of value of Jewish memory and Jewish tradition of what does that take us into decision making now. But that's not to make false equivalencies, and I actually make that very clear. I don't think that there is equivalencies there.
What about Shane, Hamas? A lot of people have compared, and I think Jamie did this, compared Hamas with the Nazis. But you argue that anti-Semitism, and I'm quoting again the title of the piece you wrote in February of this year, anti-Semitism is an insufficient and risky explanation for Hamas's, I don't know why I always call it October 6th. There must be some Freudian explanation there. October 7th attack on Israel. So is this not the Hamas pogrom? I think that's the best way to describe it, when they invaded Israel. it's not just about anti-Semitism in your view?
No, I mean, I think if you look at the Hamas attack and you look at anti-colonial attacks across kind of the kind of post-colonial world in the 20th century, they look remarkably similar because we're talking about not unsimilar political conditions. One of the problems, I think, maybe this is Jamie's position or like the position you're taking from it, is that when Jews are the target, it therefore reflexively becomes anti-Semitism. And I think we differentiate very clearly in the book that anti-Semitism is actually pretty coherent of an ideology, and you can actually parse it out from what people's behavior is. So for example, in the piece, we talk about what would something look like if it was clearly anti-Semitic, if it was motivated by anti-Semitism. Now, again, in the piece, I talk about anti-Semitism in the 1988 Hamas Charter, right? So there is actually anti-Semitic conspiracy theories in there. And then there's kind of varying degrees in later Hamas issues. But I think if we're going to look at something and want to deduce what does do about this, and I think being horrified by Hamas atrocities is important and finding a solution for it. I think a political answer here actually gives us a clearer pathway to actually do something about it than to simply project it and say, oh, this is part of a longer kind of eternal history of anti-Semitism, which in this case, I don't think that gives us many tools to work with.
James has also been an outspoken critic of wokeness, and I'm not sure if you're comfortable with that term, but you're from Portland, one of the centers of wokedom, and you're certainly a man of the left. He connects wokeness and anti-Semitism in terms of this critique of Israel. One more quick comment from Jamie, and I'd like your response on this.
Jewish rejection. The Jews have always rejected various forms of belief. They rejected Christianity. They rejected kings and queens and various, royal rulers. Their connection, their ultimate authority was God, right? During the century, they rejected communism. I mean, there were many Jews who became communists, but they had to reject their Jewish identity in order to do that. And so that's where the kind of left-wing anti-Semitism comes in, right? Is that the Jews had this other belief system. And that's why they were so oppressed in communist societies. And now, the Jews, many of the Jews reject the left's new religion, which is the religion of DEI and wokeness, if you will, for lack of a better expression. And a lot of Jews are uncomfortable with that. And for that reason, they are now being attacked.
Jamie, I think, is personalizing this. He's a critic of DEI, although he's written a very distinguished history of gay Washington. He's politicized a gay man, American gay man. Do you think he's right there? Do you think that the critique of the woke has been collapsed with anti-Semitism? Because I'm guessing you're ambivalent about the term. You may not like the word, but you're a man of the left.
So no, I don't think Jamie is correct in his assessment there. And I also don't think Jamie is correct in his assumption that the majority of Jews or a plurality of Jews kind of reject. I'm not, and I think maybe I'm unclear what he means by DEI or wokeness. I
think we all know what he means.
I think a lot of people on the left find DEI or what people call wokeness sort of like a liberal stopgap to really serious political and issues of inequality. And so in that way, I don't invest my time in DEI. But no, I don't. I think the overwhelming presence of Jews on the left shows an overwhelming Jewish support for left-wing ideals. And I think that is flat true. But I want to pick up on one thing Jamie said, because I think there's a really huge kernel of truth in something he said. And we talk about this in the book in not a way unlike what Jamie just said, which is that the Jewish kind of resistance to assimilation, the fact that Jews want to remain Jews despite what rulers or revolutionary movements might want, that is actually a piece of it. We quote from a conservative scholar, Bernard Harrison, that talks about this. And so I think that actually is an element of anti-Semitism. But this idea that somehow DEI is this coherent, overwhelming force in Western society is largely a construct that I think is being used to argue about other issues. So I think right now, for example, debates about Israel-Palestine are much more salient in Jewish communities than DEI or questions about wokeness, which I think is instead a way of looking at a political debate, a debate over DEI and wokeness, and then projecting an anti-Semitism debate on top of it where it doesn't apply.
I mean, many people on the left historically, Shane, like yourself, have simply dropped their Jewishness. They've suggested that it's incompatible with being people on the left. You think of Marx, for example. In fact, he wrote quite a lot of anti-Semitic pieces. Have you ever been tempted by that? I mean, you're clearly struggling in some senses. Is there a degree of incompatibility between cherishing and clinging to your Jewish identity and criticizing Israel, Zionism, as well as, of course, trying to make sense of anti-Semitism? Do they all fit together? Do you struggle with this? Do you sometimes think to yourself, I'm just going to stop being a public Jew. I'm just going to be a citizen of the world?
No, I'll be a Jew to the day I die. That's one of the most important things in my life. You know, me and my wife live in kind of rich Jewish tradition, keep kosher, keep Shabbos, go to shul. Those things are absolutely central to my life. And then we talk in the book about a lot of ways what we think as the solution to a lot of this alienation that maybe Jewish communities feel or fear about anti-Semitism. Part of the answer is the reclamation of Jewish tradition. And if you're talking about anti-Zionists or you're talking about critics of Israel, I actually think that that's become more and more important in those circles. Radical Jewish spaces now have more Jewish religious traditions in them than they ever did before. That is a really important piece of what's being called the Jewish left. So I don't find those things at odds at all. I will say that having a critical view on Israel can put yourself at odds with Jewish institutions and with other folks in Jewish community that you'd rather have close bonds with. And that's a serious crisis for a lot of people, as are any political disagreement that happens in those communities. And so I think that is actually where a lot of people find that kind of rub, where that becomes difficult. But I have no sort of issue with reconciling, views of wanting a better world with the healing tradition of Judaism, which is an absolute central piece of my life.
You mentioned Naomi Klein, another very prominent American Jewish progressive critic of Israel. You wrote a piece suggesting that Jewish activists mobilizing against the war in Gaza, of course, are finding a new community. Tell me about that community and how you received this community from the outside, not just from the left, but perhaps from the Arab world, from the Muslim world, from Palestinians.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. What I talk about in that piece is that that there's obviously been a growth of Jewish anti-Zionism and the Jewish left in general. Some of those folks then go on to want to build their own synagogues with their own values and their own Jewish institutions and Jewish communal life. And Jewish life in the U.S. has been built around institutions that Jews built themselves, largely because earlier they were kept out of other institutions and they wanted to be able to preserve the traditions of Jewish life. And so when folks feel at odds with those large institutions, whether it's major synagogues or organizations like the Anti-Defamation League, then they're now trying to go build their own. And so that's happening all around the country. This is the most traditionally Jewish behavior that could exist. Jews have constantly had splits and created their own communities, but they've continued to be Jewish. They carried those traditions on despite disagreement and that kind of thing. How are they accepted by the Muslim world, as you say, or by Palestinians? I mean, very warmly, right? One of the largest, kind of pro-Palestinian groups in the U.S. is Jewish Voice for Peace. Jewish organization working in direct partnership with Palestinian groups. There's always been that connection, right? And there's a whole historic tradition of that kind of collaboration. And so I think that remains actually a kind of positive, warm relationship. Don't be Pollyanna about this. There's the same disagreements between people. There's the same underlying tensions and issues on the left or in mainstream Jewish communities across different communal lines. Those continue. But I think that there is a positive move in creating some of these new institutions because it actually helps to further Jewish life and in a way create Jewish continuity, right? Another generation to hand down traditions to.
There's been an explosion of opposition to Israel and American relations with Israel on college campuses. Some people have compared it to Vietnam. Does that please or concern you?
I think
as a religious Jew on the left.
Yeah, I think so. I think the comparison probably is apt, right? This is a kind of, I think also comparing it to the, big protests against the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan. I think that the comparisons are there. I think I'm happy to see people sort of pushing against, violent warfare, against what I called fairly a genocide in Gaza. I think all of that is positive. I would love to wake up and have that not be the story we're talking about, right? Like I would love for that not to be the concentrated issue. I would much rather not have those that have this be the center of my debate if I go into synagogue or something like that. So what I would like more than anything is to find a just and lasting peace in Israel-Palestine. That is what I would actually want for that. And I think that is actually what's in the interest of Jewish safety and the interest of Jewish community, is to end the occupation, to end the violence against Palestinians. And so I think what does that is generally a good. And what I think is generally positive is that when people bring Jewish traditions into that, they make actual Judaism and Jewish community life a big visible piece of that. And I think that helps, again, break down barriers. People know each other, they have more familiarity. And that, again, I think is a centerpiece of what we talk about as Jewish safety, bonds with communities, having shared values and shared instincts.
Let's end, Shane, but final question. You sound reasonably cheerful, but there's not much to be cheerful about, is there? I mean, the chances of there being any kind of what you call peace, you put on your X page, the only lasting peace is a free Palestine. The chances of there being, quote unquote, a free Palestine are incredibly unlikely in today's geopolitical environment. What happens if there isn't a free Palestine? Does this thing just continue to fester, or could it get worse? I mean, some Jews believe that it could result in a second Holocaust or a second mass global rising against Jews or against Israel. Others believe that it's the only way to avoid that. What's your worst case scenario here?
I think the worst case scenario is that this continues and the violence only escalates over time, right? The reality is that a fair, just outcome for Palestinians is the only thing that will actually bring peace to the region. And so finding those political solutions are really the only option we have. If you're talking about my optimism, again, we just talked about this across the hour. My optimism is based in a lot of ways the traditions I come from, which are about looking forward and trying to build a better world, both in Judaism and the political realm. And so we have to have a certain amount of that optimism. There is a utopian impulse that drives that. We are here to actually heal the world. And so I think committing to that has to say constantly, what is it going to take to get there, right? Because as we talked about, as this historic split in the Jewish community, I am not taking a fatalist position. I'm not taking an eternalist position about anti-Semitism or assuming that it's inevitable. Instead, I'm saying this is a force of oppression to fight, just like oppression that Palestinians face, and finding some way of basically commingling those, of building large-scale movements against shared sources. I think that is the actual option we have. But no, I'm not going to be, I am not looking at what's happening in Israel, Palestine, and saying, hey, there's a clear, easy pathway out right now, right? We're talking about entrenched power systems in Israel, a further shift to the right. I mean, it's Israeli politics, further militancy. And that, I think, is a problem. I think the light side of that is that globally, including amongst the Jewish population, people are saying no more. They do not want to see this play out. And I also want us to walk back this sort of frantic position that these conflicts lead for somehow to a second Holocaust. And I think like it's not helpful for us to kind of look at these situations and have wild fantasies about what's going to play out. Instead, we should actually look at what we can do. Look at the reality about anti-Semitism on the ground, where it is, where it isn't. And right now in the United States, the biggest threat to Jews is white Christian nationalism, the growth of the far right, the alt-right, the dissident right, and the shift into anti-Semitism amongst even mainstream right-wing politicians. That, I think, if we're talking about American Jewish safety, is a really important issue that gets undercut when we focus only on Israel-Palestine.
And what happens if Trump is elected or re-elected in November? He has a Jewish son-in-law, Jewish grandchildren. He seems to be quite close intellectually and emotionally with Netanyahu. He has the support of fundamental Christians who embrace the ideal of Zionism. If Trump is elected in November, how much worse can the situation get if he gives Netanyahu the green light for a real genocide against the Palestinian people?
I mean, I think it gets exponentially worse. I think this notion that because of, Trump's support for moving the embassy or connection to Likud or support of Christian Zionists lends itself to sort of a testimony of Jewish safety is wrong. The reality is that, for example, evangelical Christians do not offer sort of a political vision that's safe for Jews in the United States. Christian nationalism does not have a place for Jews. And even their support of Israel is very contingent on their eschatology, by which Jews either are killed or forced to convert to Christianity, therefore ceasing to be Jews. And so I think we have to actually look at, when we talk about these institutions of Jewish safety or these political solutions that are coming from the right, what do they actually mean for Jewish life? What do they actually mean for the continuance of Jewish peoplehood and Jewish tradition? That, I think, is unsafe. Also, very importantly, Trump's over-reliance on conspiracy theories, pushing the right even further right on these issues, has only brought anti-Semitism back into the framework.
I'm ready to attack Andrew King. Yeah, he's the one to bash, asking questions, no filter, just keeps on grinning. He's the man who's got the whole crowd spinning. Money, fame, success, it's all in his sight. He'll dig deep, expose you with all his might. No sugarcoating, he'll cut right through. Andrew King, he's the one to spew. Yeah, he's an expert.